welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pickle. My name is Juan Francisco Muñoz, and I'm as always joined by my colleague Ronan Wordsworth. How are you, Ronan?
I'm doing well, thank you. Very much enjoying the warm weather here in Prague at the moment.
We finally are in summer!
It's going great. What about yourself? How are you doing?
Well, it's not bad. I'm about to finish my job. I've been working for 2 years and a half in the same place. I'm about to quit, so it feels like summer is here.
More time to focus on the pickle. That's the real
I
reason.
will definitely try to invest more time in the pickle, and maybe, who knows, maybe we can get live and actually do some live streaming if I manage to control and to be an expert in how to use OBS. We will see it. Have you been following the Club World Cup in the US?
Yeah, a little bit, but I mean, it's trying to be a premier sporting competition, obviously sponsored by the Sauds. And I think if you want to get more information about that, we recorded an episode almost 2 years ago now, in the lead up to the Qatar World Cup, actually 3 years ago, talking about the influence of sports washing and money in sports and how that impacts geopolitics. I think this is just yet another example of that trend towards money being the major player for sports. But it's still fun. It's still fun in the off season. I mean, right now it's Australian football season for me normally, so that's what I'm watching.
That's why I think you're not enjoying it that much because your team is not playing that well. Maybe. If you want to check out that episode on Sportswashing, we did it with our colleague and friend Owen Sutherland, and we will leave the link in the description. And today, well, at the time that we are recording this episode, there's many important geopolitical things going on, and today we're going to be discussing a little bit what is the situation, the security situation, the geopolitical situation, and the impressions and ideas in this field that are going around Europe. And I think we can start. In the second week of June, Prague hosted the 20th anniversary edition of GLOBSEC Forum, one of Europe's most important events for discussion of the fields of defense, technology, geopolitics, and global security.
Now, neither of us were actually at the conference, the security forum there. However, this is our opportunity to actually introduce to the podcast for the first time one of our new analysts that have come on board, and I'm sure if you've signed up for the newsletter, you can see some of the good work coming out from there. So this is the first of the analysts that we have on board joining us today. So I'll welcome Matt Heibel to the Geopolitical Pickle for the first time.
Happy to be here. Happy to be part of the pickle sphere, as we might start calling it.
We welcome Matt, and you can talk a little bit about yourself if you want.
Sure. First, I started working for Aspen Institute Central Europe, and as a good trained lawyer, I'm going to say a caveat, which is all of the opinions are just observations by me, and not at all official opinions for Aspen Institute CE or Aspen Institute from the U.S. I am from the U.S., from Alaska, and lived around the world, was in the U.S. military, a prosecutor by trade, and like you guys said, now I'm taking a break and doing something a little bit more low-key, like geopolitics. So
you're absolutely low-key.
Great to have you join us here on military discussion, especially given your background.
That's right.
Well, that's really interesting. And you were the one that were there in GLOBSEC. Thank you, Aspen, for sponsoring this participation.
Also, I was going to say that caveat is a very American thing. So if you could tell before by his accent, that was the first giveaway that you have to say that caveat before you come on any podcast or any live discussion or anything like that. But first of all, about GLOBSEC, do you want to give us a background of what you expected going in and what some of the key takeaways potentially were before we dive into some of the more detail orientated stuff?
Sure. So like Juanfrey said, it's 20-year anniversary. It started in Bratislava, my understanding, in just a university room basement, essentially, of some local experts talking about global security. 20 years later, this is a very polished, very intricate 3 or 2.5 day forum. So you're talking about speakers who are high level. So there was the president of Georgia, the president of Azerbaijan was there, a lot of foreign ministers. The keynote speaker was President Zelensky giving an address live from Ukraine. President Pavel of the Czech Republic opened the entire conference. So a lot of pretty high-level names that are either currently in government, just out of government, or high-level in some of the private sector. So it definitely was very polished. There was nothing wrong with it. This was not an event that was haphazardly thrown together. It was at the Hilton, right? They had everything catered and all of these sorts of things where when you went, and I'm just an attendee, you came away thinking these people knew at least how to put on a conference.
That's fairly interesting because I've checked the list of guest speakers. And there's been a couple there that we've interviewed before. There was Hideo Suzuki, the former Japanese ambassador to the Czech Republic, and I forgot his name. The Czech special envoy for the Thomas Kopecki, exactly. So a couple of them we've interviewed them ourselves, and when I realized that I knew that the forum was going to take place, but I wasn't sure actually about the dates because I feel like other years has been a little bit earlier, but I'm not sure. It was 500 meters away from my place, and I realized when the tickets were already gone and there was no way of getting in. So yeah, kind of disappointed. Really interesting then, Matt. What do you think was if you could put in one phrase, what was the main highlight?
Well, the theme that GLOBSEC put on this conference itself was, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it sounds very regal, commanding in chaos. It's time for Europe to step up. And so even though this is a forum that mostly featured speakers from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Baltics, or the Nordic European countries, there's often this idea about kind of what Europe in general or collectively can do in terms of security. And the overarching theme was basically we've lived under a free security blanket for the last 30 plus years. And now that blanket has been ripped off and it's time for Europe to step up. And there was sort of various, probably 4 or 5 themes that or sub-themes that came out of that. But that's the overall take. And it was mostly a positive, we can do this attitude. We now know the problem. We all understand what the issue is. It just takes some will, some innovation, and a couple of things. But so it was a positive, forward-looking thing that Europe has a lot of potential to get back to where it wants to be, but noting that it's not where it wants to be right now.
There was definitely seeing the guests, and obviously because it happened in Prague, and GLOBSEC is based in Bratislava, I believe. Obviously, it has to have a Central/Eastern European component. Did you think that was clear there? For example, more focus on Ukraine, more focus on aspects of energy security?
Definitely. I think GLOBSEC did itself proud in terms of it would say every speaker was, what can Europe do? What can Europe do? But really, they needed parentheses before that and saying, what can certain parts of Europe do? Because they were only talking to an audience of, like you said, Central Europe where it's based. There's a lot of Russia-based talk. So anyone who's feeling threatened by Russia. So again, Eastern European, Central, Nordic countries like Sweden and Finland, and the Baltics. There wasn't a lot of voices from Western Europe, from Southern Europe, from your home country of Spain. So it talked about Europe in general, but really it was ignoring maybe half of what the European coalition was, whether that's NATO or the EU. But what it did was really focus on problems that are very clear and central to Europe. So like I said, President Zelensky was the keynote speaker. He started off the first morning basically, and that really set the tone because every single speaker talked about how Ukraine's war is our war, Ukraine's peace must be our peace, Ukraine's victory must be our victory. And that was a thread that happened throughout the entire conference. There was not really a question of, hey, how can we capitulate to peace? Hey, maybe Russia's not as bad as people are making them out to be. Hey, can we find a different way forward? Nope, it was we need to support Ukraine 100% because they are us and Russia is someone that we all need to be worried about.
I think you touched on a few important points. I know we already had an episode fully looking into the revitalization of the European defense industry. And much of this rhetoric, I guess, is very similar to that we need to take care of our own collective defense. Obviously, with these Eastern Bloc, former Soviet countries and then potential Central European countries, the threat perception from Russia is felt much more acutely
for sure
than, say, the Western European countries. But then, despite the fact that France and Germany and these really powerhouses of European industry and probably the way forward for the arms development were not there necessarily in large numbers, do you feel like that could have held it back in terms of the effectiveness of messaging? Because I think one of the things that Europe has been good at is making these statements about working together more cohesively.
If Europe is good at doing something, it's not making statements.
Exactly. I mean, we look at the facts. Like at the moment, for this to be successful, in my eyes, there has to be this integrated development in industrial capacity as well. Because at the moment, France still wants to develop the French weapons, and Germany is going to want to spend their money within Germany on the German systems. But really, like to be effective, needs to be some sort of interconnectivity between the different industries. I don't know if that was a theme that was talked on there.
I mean, I suppose the NATO summit's happening, this week, right? So we'll see how it happens Europe en masse. I imagine if I'm Central Europe and maybe I'm not as strong of GDP or not as big a voice in terms of the NATO, that maybe you do want a unified message first within sort of a mini block of where you're at, such that you can just project unanimity and kind of a shared message, so that when you all do end up at a NATO summit or an EU conference, you're saying, listen, we all are on board with this, right? We've all sort of decided amongst ourselves that this is what we need to do. So you've sort of had this conversation between yourselves first, and then almost presenting it to a potentially larger audience.
I like that idea. And then one follow-up question just on that as well then. Like, particularly if we see the real problem children, I guess, of EU and NATO are here in this region. We talk about Hungary and Slovakia. Obviously, this was a Bratislava-based security forum. I don't know what the Slovak representation was like. Did you see government representatives from these anti-increase in defense spending? They kind of want some sort of rapprochement with Russia to end the war rather than the hard military, which is being pushed by the rest of Europe.
It's a great question. I mean, of course, you can't go to every single panel. There's 3 different rooms going on at once. I chose the ones that were interesting or whatever it was. Hungary, I did not see represented a lot. In terms of Slovakia, there was some, but it was from former governments for sure, right? So maybe governments that are a bit more friendly to NATO, a bit more friendly to the EU. That is in and itself a little bit of the problem. When you're out of government and you were in before, you tend to think of today's problems as something that weren't your problems maybe 10 years ago, however it was. And so you got a lot of kind of people from the same era of politics, the same era in military service. Not that that's wrong, but it felt somewhat redundant in terms of everyone is kind of coming from the same background. And again, maybe that was on purpose, right? They wanted to have sort of a clear message. But when you're talking about panels, it was a little bit surprising there wasn't as much disagreement as I thought there would be. There was some obviously minor disagreements, but in terms of big policy disagreements, I didn't really see much of that in the panel. Everyone has pretty much agreed that Europe has to deregulate to make innovation easier for the military, for technology. Europe needs to spend more on the military. Ukraine is a number 1 priority. Russia is the biggest threat. I mean, all of these were like taken as not even debatable facts. And I imagine for most people that's correct, but maybe it's on purpose that there wasn't a big Hungarian representation at something like this.
Maybe they didn't want to go either, because it's clearly, as you're saying, if there's a line in the end, all these conferences, all these forums in the end, you more or less know that there is a line, especially if you're going to have really high-ranked officials, for example, coming there. I saw that there was the Prime Minister of Armenia, the President of Georgia, as you mentioned before, and so on. So it definitely, there is a line there. If you check the guest list, there is a conductive idea.
President of Azerbaijan is an interesting one.
I got to see him for about 10 or 15 minutes. That was really interesting. He talked a lot about the peace with Armenia, but didn't really mention the background of how that occurred.
Yeah, that happens. I want to ask you, so as I was mentioning, it's more focused in Central Eastern Europe, and obviously Russia is the biggest threat for these countries. I know that Czech President Peter Pavel, he did mention the United States and its current administration, how that's affecting or how that will or should affect the reaction of the Europeans. You being American yourself,
here we go.
We always have the voice of Australia and Spain. How do you think it was perceived, this foreign policy of the current American administration?
It was something I was actually really curious coming into, because these are, like you mentioned, people in government from 10 or so years ago, maybe less, maybe not, but that were not currently dealing with Trump policies, right? So they're dealing with, whether it's George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Biden, maybe even the first Trump, where you can see some sort of through line. Now, forget about tariffs, right? Just talking about the security sphere. How were they going to react to Trump? And I think there was a couple different themes that came out of it. And there was plenty of American speakers, I should say, from ex-government, military, business, etc. One of them was, everyone agreed, I would say the through line was, a lot of American presidents have been telling Europe to rearm for 20 plus years. Trump's just the one that's done it in the most brash, direct way that maybe potentially is getting the results that
most effective
that America has been wanting. You know, Barack Obama asked this, Clinton, you know, Biden, Bush, everyone's done this. So it was a sort of idea that, okay, we might not like it, but Trump is right on that sort of thing. Number two, there was the idea that, listen, Europe and America are always going to be friends. We're just fighting a little bit right now. Europe is not moving towards China. Like, our alliance is going to be fine. We're just kind of in a rough spot, which I think is a very positive, optimistic view of things. And it was almost sort of ignoring the real, potentially perceived disdain that the Trump administration has for European militaries specifically. It felt like they were acknowledging it, but not giving it the due that, you know, they thought, hey, once we start spending, the relationship will be better again. We'll be on the same track militarily wise. And where else are we going to go? We're not going to go to China. We're not going to go to Russia. Europe and America are always going to be friends, which again is a great message of unity. But I think it really, by not talking about it more and really, I don't know, you know, in a relationship, you hash out your problems, you get to the bottom of things. I think there was a lot of just, let's smooth this over and let's move on.
And I mean, on that, especially given that if we look at the two major conflicts going on right now, obviously this is being recorded after Israel and Iran have apparently agreed a ceasefire, but there was severe bombing raids over the last 12 days and a full-scale conflict in the Middle East rising. So I think you put in there a note, especially on one of the panels, specifically around the response that Europe had to Israel bombing Iran and kind of their lack of ability to do anything and intervene in any meaningful way. And I guess that also plays into the same way they were sidelined in the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, where the US kind of went over the top of everyone and said, we're going to have these negotiations directly. And kind of what's the overarching mood then, I mean, not just with America, but like Europe's spot at this global table when they're not able to be there and actually influential in any way in this decision-making of key global, historic events, I guess.
This was super interesting because the conference was Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and we showed up Friday morning and the initial Israeli bombing had just happened. So this is completely new and fresh, the very first one that occurred. And there's a panel, and I believe it was the Czech National Security Advisor, and there was a diplomat from the UAE. So there was some Middle East contingent there that was more than just for that panel, but there as well. And it was just the two of them plus the moderator. And as you mentioned, the Czech, I'm going to say National Security Advisor. If I get it wrong, I apologize. He basically said what you said, which was, Europe doesn't have a seat at this table. I mean, they might call America on this, but they're not going to call us. We don't have an army. We don't have the diplomatic currency to intervene. We sort of lost that. And, you know, I grew up, I was in the service in post 9/11 when before China kind of rose, before Russia kind of re-rose, and Europe was the only really other major actor on the scene besides the United States in that time. So they were seen as a natural counterbalance. So almost by default, they had seats at the table for these sort of international things. Now that China has risen so dramatically, now that Russia has sort of inserted itself back into at least regional, if not global affairs, Europe, I don't think, knows where to go and what to do, because they haven't made this collective decision to become a military force. They've kind of gone the opposite way, right? They're going to become this economic force. And so when other people start becoming more potentially important players, and there's only so many seats at that global table, Europe is, I think, realizing, or has been realizing in real time, that one, do they want a seat at this table, right? Is that something that they want, or would they rather be more closely involved to things that are closer to home? Russia to the east, America to the west, the middle, potentially the Middle East, but really North Africa to the south, right? Or do they want to see themselves as a world player still? And I think that's an open question. I think that different European capitals might have different answers to that. But the point of this Czech National Security Advisor is right now, doesn't matter what Europe wants, it doesn't have the ability to kind of force itself into these conversations. And that was a rude awakening for some people, I think.
I think, which is crazy to me, because, I mean, if we talk about the EU as a bloc, as you said, they're not the military power that the US has, but what they do have is economic power. And for Israel, for example, the number one trading partner for them is the EU. Right? I think there's some sort of reluctance within the EU to use that power on a global stage with the US, especially to go against the US's interests. They would only ever follow with sanctions what the US is doing. Even now we see with the latest round of sanctions against Russia trying to be pushed through on the US, but obviously Donald Trump is quite resistant to imposing more sanctions on Russia. And this is going to be something that's also going to be debated, I'm sure, at the NATO summit this week. So I think, I don't know, was there any discussion about potentially using these other weapons at the disposal of the EU or not really?
To me, it calls the attention the fact that I understand, and we said it several times already, there is a focus on Central Eastern Europe, so it's a focus on problems of Central and Eastern Europe. But when you talk about it as Europe, I would say Europe, for example, has a lot of interests in the Middle East. As you see, since 2011, since the Arab Spring and so on, the massive amount of migration that was the waves of refugees that were coming from Syria, from Tunisia, crossing through Turkey, affecting all this area. I mean, these countries, according to the agreement that they reached in the European Union to divide the refugees that were coming from the Syrian civil war, for example, these countries had to accept several thousands, although then they didn't. But they had to be on the table to deal with issues that were happening in this region. The case of, I understand that for countries in Northern Europe, for example, what happens in Africa doesn't really affect them, but at the same time, this migration does affect everywhere. And
sure.
From on the top of my head, if, let's say, there is a collapse of the regime in Iran is a country that borders with one of the main gas providers of the European Union, which is Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, one country that aspires to access the European Union, as it's Georgia.
And Turkey.
And Turkey.
Which also, once aspired to be part of the European Union as well.
Exactly. Once aspired to be part of the European Union, and it's still part of the near vicinity, is still bordering the European Union, Bulgaria and Greece. So there is some interest, and that's why I'm interested in that you're saying that difference of those other problems.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think it's a lack of interest. I think it is the lack of not being sure how to influence to either protect or promote those interests, right? In terms of Israeli and American relationship, there's a whole different podcast on that you guys are coming up. But at some point, 20 years ago, when there was a potential for two-state solution, Europe was basically the main backer of the Palestinian Authority, right? And America for Israel. And it was sort of this one patron per actor in that specific conflict. Now, so Europe and Israel, who knows what their specific relationship is, but the Czech National Security Advisor's point was the EU does not have an army. And while potential national armies could maybe do something, there's just not a lot of appetite for that in Europe. And they don't, to wield economic sanctions, they have to do so unanimously and collectively, right? Which has been, from my understanding, that's both the beauty of the EU experiment and also the bug, right? Of getting every country from Hungary to the Netherlands to agree on a specific thing when there are such different priorities. So certainly like I said, there was an entire delegation there from Middle Eastern countries. There was a panel about Middle Eastern peace process. So that interest is there. But in terms of how Europe can influence that region, I don't think they have a good idea on what they can do, and they definitely can't do anything militarily, at least not collectively, right?
Yeah, so it's in the end understanding the European Union as not as a homogeneous entity, but more of this heterogeneous mix. I want to touch into one of the key takeaways that you shared with us before, and it's as you wrote it, the urgent need to abandon illusions and confront the ongoing global disruption transforming the economy, geopolitics, and security, emphasizing that it's time to modernize multilateralism rather than merely defend outdated systems.
This was from GLOBSEC itself, right? The thing I copy and pasted in the website.
Because I also read it, and I'm interested in understanding if there is a support for this idea of United States and Europe in the same boat, although there's some differences. Russia is this actor. We are not going to come closer to China.
Right.
How do you leverage this, or how do you modernize this multilateralism?
Those are very polished takeaways that I think GLOBSEC sent us out afterwards, and I was pleased to see that their takeaways, while very polished, generally matched what I took away in a much more rough sketch. One of the biggest things that they talked about over and over again through various panels, various speakers, was the amount of regulation that was going on, both in the US and the EU, and how that regulation was essentially strangling any chance of Europe to kind of get back on a solid, positive-looking footing. It was talking about defense. It was talking about rare earth minerals in terms of how long it takes to get from discovering something to actually getting it out of the ground and doing these sorts of things. It was talking about tech innovation. It was talking about defense-based tech innovation. It was talking about nuclear energy, which was a big through line. And all of these, there was a big common consensus that we have regulated ourselves into obscurity and into complete inefficiency. I don't remember exactly who said the stat. I believe it was an individual from the US talked about how 40% of their operating budget was regulation compliance. And that is a problem that is on both sides of the Atlantic. And they didn't offer necessarily solutions on how to deregulate because, again, from Europe's perspective, a lot of that comes from that macro EU level, right? So they have to get everyone to agree to really go in and cut regulations where it makes sense. But I think that there is, on both sides of the pond, this growing consensus that the regulations that maybe were well thought out at the time and maybe had a good idea at the time are just not working now, and everyone's just doing it because they're doing it and not for a very good reason. So this is a huge through line, was we need to cut down all of this. The unspoken thing from all of this was zero climate change mention.
Mm-hmm. That's what I wanted to ask.
Zero.
Yes, there is nothing on that. No?
Nothing.
I didn't read anything at all.
Nothing.
I mean, this is a complicated situation, right? Because obviously these regulations are introduced to A, protect the climate, B, to make citizens' lives better and do all the proper planning and regulatory work to ensure that projects don't just destroy the environment in someone's backyard, for instance. I know, for instance, in the UK, the current nuclear reactor that's being built at Hinkley Point is taken like 15, 20 years in construction, and even longer when you go back to when it was in the planning stage to get through these regulatory hurdles, which I understand. I do think in nuclear especially, very much so Europe and America.
You don't want to cut corners on a nuclear reactor, right?
Of course, but they've kind of become uncompetitive completely because of these hurdles. And I think around specific industries, it's especially bad. Nuclear being a key one. As you said, I think there's a lot of focus on using this as a future, especially when we have like AI data centers, for instance, that will need huge amounts of power to be able to run. Where's that power going to come from? And I think you highlighted there as well, like when we talk about fossil fuels, obviously that's terrible for the climate. The alternative, we have renewable energy that is able to scale only in certain areas, that's going to be economically viable. And then it leads us to a situation where nuclear is the most viable option. But here in Europe, we have such strict guidelines on how to build new nuclear projects that it's not necessarily going to become a viable solution long term unless that completely changes that framework of which it exists. And I think if we look at Russia, for example, they're very competitive in the nuclear space. They use this kind of nuclear diplomacy, I think, all over Africa, for instance, signing different agreements. They built a reactor in Turkey. They built a reactor in Egypt. I mean, when we look at the difference there, I think Europe doesn't have any big nuclear companies. I mean, France is the only one that is able to produce.
At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I remember a statistic that I think Ukraine produced more nuclear energy than every other country except for France in the EU together.
Yeah, I believe that for sure. And I mean, when we look at, this was why the loss of Niger was a blow for France, which we covered many years ago in a podcast now. Mm-hmm. But I think this is like very much highlights some of the European issues, right? If we talk about critical mineral supply chain, it's going to be the same sort of topics brought up. I mean, there is some critical minerals here in Europe, not everything. But even when we talk about critical minerals, say in Africa, the ability to extract those is quite costly when you have to take into account the environmental regulations, which is why China is so much further ahead and able to undercut the market so much in critical minerals. And so I'm interested to see, like, as you said, there wasn't many solutions given, but like, what was the outlook in general like for these, I guess, vital industries for the next 20, 30 years?
They did have a positive outlook on it. We have problems, as you all mentioned, as you just mentioned, but technology around nuclear is certainly on the upswing. Right? I remember, you guys remember 10 plus years ago after Fukushima in 2011, Germany was going to shut down all of its reactors, right? Nuclear was just absolutely toxic, and that is not a pun, like it was just politically toxic. Now it is the opposite. We were swung back around. They kept talking about these things called SMRs, which are small modular reactors that are basically a lot more plug and play, right? And so these massive projects like the one you mentioned, they're built 3 to 5 years is the goal. And yeah, they don't produce as much energy, but you can scale them better. You can fit them in smaller areas. And so then all of a sudden you're not relying on this one big, huge power plant. That's, by the way, a target if you are thinking about it that way. They even talked about the possibility of micro reactors that you fit on the back of a semi truck. You know, how much this was just talk and how much this was actually possible. I'm certainly no expert whatsoever. But the fact that there is buzz around nuclear energy and there's being money invested into that, I think it seems very much like a part of the future. I think most people would agree that in terms of energy independence, which is a big part of what Europe's trying to achieve, it cannot be a one solution. It's a kind of everything needs to have its place, and that's renewables, that's potentially some fossil fuels. I mean, there's a whole big kerfuffle the last couple of weeks where Czech Republic was trying to get a nuclear reactor, and they went with a Korean company. The French company that got second was very unhappy, and there was some dust up in the European courts that I think is now settled. But the point is, it's moving in this space. It's not a dead industry anymore. And I think most people, if they had a choice between nuclear power, like you said, that you can stick anywhere, you're not relying on what's in the ground, versus some very dirty, costly fossil fuels like coal, I think people probably push towards nuclear. That does seem more of a future technology. In terms of some of the other development, there's some very drones was obviously a huge topic that was running through. Operation Spiderweb had just occurred within the last 2 weeks. It's the huge drone, strike that happened over multiple targets by Ukraine within, well inside of Russia. Everyone was obviously hugely supportive of that, but they also had industry people. Helsing is a quite, I think, famous European company that is really, really doing a great job in drones. And one of the coolest things that they said that really resonated with me was that drone hardware is pretty easy. It's just a couple of propellers, a body, these sorts of things. It's not that hard you don't need special substances to build it. Most of the upswing and most of is in software. So they're mostly a software company. So the drones are easy to produce. The bodies itself, it is the brain inside the drone that really makes it something that's not so valuable. It's something that's really valuable. And thinking about it that way, all of these soft technologies that do not require hardware, earth minerals, big substances, expensive equipment, that seems like an area that Europe especially, that maybe is a bit behind on their military industrial capacity, could really find a space into.
And just on the drones, I know because you said obviously Zelensky brought it up in his keynote address. Was there talk about potential partnership between Ukraine and Europe in developing this industry? Because I would say right now, based on battlefield experience, Ukraine and Russia are probably the two most advanced drone-capable countries in the world.
And Iran and Turkey.
Turkey was definitely the leader for the last decade, and Iran followed them. And now I think those two, just through pure usage.
In drone warfare, for sure.
Exactly, because of the innovation that needs to come out.
Even in defense against drones.
Exactly. Both sides have had to, by necessity, develop better capable systems, develop countermeasures against those. And then, again, I think for me, that seems like a logical ally where you can really get Ukrainians integrated into the European system.
It absolutely is, and it was something that was mentioned a number of times by a lot of different speakers, was that Ukraine is not a charity case. They are a very valuable ally, and something that I think a lot of people, especially in the U.S., don't think about. They think about Ukraine's a little brother getting picked on by a big bad brother, and we need to go help them out because we don't like Russia, or that's the right thing to do. Obviously, I'm simplifying things, but in terms of Europe, whatever was the situation in 2022, the situation in 2025 is that Ukraine has proved very resourceful. I think something like they said 60% of their own equipment is made in Ukraine. So their defense industry is now very sophisticated, and they're on the cutting edge of drone warfare, which most people believe will at least have a very large part in the future. And so it wasn't just, hey, we should let Ukraine in to whether it's the EU or NATO because we feel bad about them and we want to help them. It's because they would actually be quite valuable. If we want Europe to be a force to be reckoned with militarily again, here's a great example of a smaller country taking on a bigger country. We're talking about doctrine. We're talking about tactics. We're talking about technology. We'd be leaving, money on the table if we didn't partner up with them. And the flip side of it is, if Russia happens to win, guess where all of that technology could fall into the hands of? The country that you absolutely do not want to have it.
That's a great point, I think, and really highlights, obviously, this through message which was there, which was Europe needs to support Ukraine regardless of what's happening in Washington. They are our number one security concern right now, right?
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about technology, we've talked about geopolitics, we've talked about energy. Is there any other topic that we need to cover? Or those are the main key takeaways of how does this part of Europe see the world?
The Friday night cocktail party was absolutely on point. It was in Joffin Palace in the middle of the river. So kind of looping all the way to the first callback was one, very European, and two, a very sharp, well put on 2.5 day conference that I would love to attend again.
Okay, we'll try next year. Let's see if we can, if we are the ones that can get you in.
Sponsored by the pickle. Yeah, that's right.
Get a geopolitical pickle.
Yeah. We can have you as speaker, Ronan, and then he can also go. Okay, well, Matt, how was your first experience in the podcast?
It was great. You guys, it's as if we're talking and having beers. We were not, but it's as if we were.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, you will be here more in the near future already. So thank you very much for coming today, Matt. Thank you very much, Ronan. I don't know if you had anything else to say.
No, that's good for me. I think we have highlighted the European perspective of security now. I think that was the key takeaway for me from this, is like getting to understand exactly what is being thought in the defense circles of this part of Europe. I think, it's kind of what we've talked about before, but to go deeper into some of the different aspects, which is kind of at the policy level for particularly some of the Eastern European countries here.
To me, it highlights a little bit the existence of different perspectives within Europe that are really different. Seeing the lineup of speakers, it was clear that there was an idea, which I understand, but it clearly shows, or for example, now Spain managing to get an agreement with NATO of not raising to 5% of GDP expenditure in military, but they will do it somehow else. I still have to read how they want to do it. But it definitely shows that there is a big difference in how the Europeans perceive the world. So we will be here to analyze it and talk about it.
Thank you for listening as well. So as always, get in touch if you have any comments or want us to dive deeper into this or any other topic. And we'll catch you next time on the Geopolitical Pickle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Geopolitical Pickle is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz. Follow us on Instagram at The Geopolitical Pickle or Twitter at The Geopickle for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.